monthly speaker series around commercialization topics of interest. And we generally do this every month. We're trying to discuss topics especially relevant to our faculty and student inventors here at Penn, but also of interest to anyone in the community who wants to learn more about them. I actually put in the chat a link to all of our upcoming events because we have a number of guest speakers coming in over the next few months around topics of interest. But today I'm really pleased to welcome very close partners of Penn from Osage University Partners, which is a firm that works with universities across the country and invests and supports a lot of early stage inventors and startups. So we love working with Osage because I think they understand some of the unique challenges and opportunities that early stage technology right out of universities present. And today I'm really happy to have two folks from Osage, Matt Cohen and Nabil Ullah, here to talk about a really great topic for, I guess, our clientele. And I'll let you folks introduce yourselves, but I'll just note that I saw Matt's a Penn graduate and Nabil is a graduate of another university very close to Penn. But thank you for being here, and I'll hand it over to you all. And I'll just say I'm happy to moderate questions in the chat or however you all like to do this, if you want folks to ask questions as you go or however I can be helpful. But thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Laurie. I appreciate it. Nabil, why don't you pull up the slide deck here? It's great to see all these people joining. I recognize folks from within Penn. I even recognize folks from without Penn that I know. So,
do you mind enabling screen sharing?
Start with
Right,
an
awesome.
introduction. So I'm Matt Cohen. I'm one of the managing partners at OUP. As Laurie said, I am a Penn graduate. I did my Ph.D. at Penn in cell and molecular biology group, and focused on viral immunology in Stu Isaac's lab, working on pox viruses. So. But following my PhD at Penn, I moved into industry. I spent time at LEK as a strategy consultant out of their New York office, worked primarily with pharma, med tech, biotech, and some private equity clients, and did that for a number of years, working with them on mostly strategic related questions and issues. And then a little over 9 years ago, I moved back to the Philadelphia area where we're based, and have been with OUP since. So I started as an associate at OUP. I'm now a managing partner. It's been a great run. I joined when we were in our first fund, so in the very early days at OUP, and now we are currently just started investing out of our fourth fund. So it's been great to see the firm grow and evolve. And one of those folks we've added over the last several years who's really done a great job at OUP is Nabil. So we'll let Nabil introduce himself, and for the talk today, we'll go through the agenda here in a moment, but we'll try not to spend too much time or any time talking about what we do, and but happy to answer questions on that if folks care at the end. So Nabil, why don't I turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself. If you're still there.
Sorry about that. I just got disconnected for a moment there. Thanks for bearing with me. It's nice to meet all of you. My name is Nabil Ullah. I joined OUP a year and a half ago now. And prior to that, I worked at Goldman Sachs for 2 years. And prior to that, as Laurie had mentioned, I graduated from Drexel University. My role here at OUP, I'm the senior investment analyst. I help support a number of different functions across our life science team and tech team, as well as our university relations team. And some of that includes content creation like this. And we recently updated the data behind this analysis, and we actually also have a blog written about it. So feel free to check that out after the presentation if you're interested. All right, I'll just move on to the agenda here and let Matt kick it off.
Thanks, Nabil. So these are the big key topics we're going to talk about today. Really we're focused on founders' equity. So how do you split the pie when you first start a company? And then what happens to that pie over time as the company has to raise money? And then what are the different implications you might want to think about when you take money from investors, at various valuations. We'll start really just the high-level summary, which I'll provide. We'll talk about some key terms and definitions. I'll turn it over to Nabil for that, and he'll walk through understanding cap tables, which is how a company displays their equity ownership. And Nabil will talk more about dilution and some data we've collected from startups that we work with and we've invested in, and what's happened over time. We'll provide some industry averages. So, when you first start the company, before you ever take a dollar, what should the CEO get? What should founders get? And it depends, and as you'll hear from Nabil, it depends a little bit on their role. We'll talk a little bit about ownership and exits. So, what happens to your cap table over time, and how does that impact who gets what when the company is ultimately acquired? And at the end, hopefully we'll have time and we'll take questions. So Nabil, why don't we move to the next slide? So why give equity at all? Why does it matter? And so there's really two reasons why equity is important. The first is you want to reward past performance. When you're forming a company, presumably, given it's a spin out from a university and from Penn, there's been a whole lot of work and effort and money put into developing some technology that's going to be the foundation for the company. And so people get equity in the startup as a reward. Hey, you've done a lot, you've contributed a lot, therefore, you should get a little bit of piece of this company. So that's sort of the first reason. I would say the second reason is even more important, and that's to incentivize future performance. So we can talk more about this later, but when you're looking to have people in your company to make it successful, grow it, you need to give them something that helps them capture the upside in success. If that company does really well and it grows, that they are compensated for that. And so if you are, for example, someone who's contributed in the past to technology, but don't plan to contribute into the future, you might get a piece of equity. If you're someone who is joining the company and had no role in maybe the invention of the technology, you also get a piece of the company because you're going to be contributing going forward, and there's going to be incentives for future performance. And if you're someone who's involved in both, you may get more than either of those two. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why it's an incentive. And some of that has to do with the concept of vesting. You don't give somebody all of their ownership all at once. They actually earn it over time. And so we'll talk more about that later. Finally, I just want to make the point that, when you're looking to hire people as a startup, you may not always have a ton of cash. So you may not be able to pay them competitive salaries, for example, if they were to go to Google versus to your startup. And so one of the ways you incentivize them to come to the startup is you grant them equity. You grant them the ability to capture upside in the success of the company rather than a higher salary net. So that's just high level, and we'll go into all those points in more detail as we go through this. So here's just an example cap table. So without getting into the details of how much does the CEO get, how much do the founders get, how much do the employees get, let's just start with a really basic pie. So we split it up into three ways initially. There's the lead founder or CEO, who would maybe get 40%. there are the co-founders and all the employees who maybe would get 40%. And then you also need an option pool. And so just to start with that first 40%, the lead founder, CEO. So this would be the initial CEOs, lead founder. It could be more than one person. They're typically going to get the largest chunk of the ownership. This person, as sort of a joke here, is 200% full time. So this person is basically living and breathing, not just 8 hours a day, but 24 hours a day. The initial success of the company, getting it off the ground. They're likely going to be in that role for a long period of time. You certainly wouldn't want to give sort of someone who's only going to spend the first 3 months of the company in this role and then leave that sort of ownership. But this is somebody, again, as we write here, with staying power. And that initial equity, it has a range. We put 40% here for illustrative purposes, but 30 to 60% of the company is what we typically see. The second major bucket here is the other 40%. These are the co-founders and key employees. Can include founding scientists, other C-level executives like CSO, VP level, any initial employees that join. And I would say that, investors do typically like to see some sort of initial team in place before investing in a company. Sometimes, it's just one person. Sometimes it's two people. Often it's a small team of core people who are going to, come and join the company and make it happen. We recognize as investors that some folks, especially at the junior level, may not want to commit and join a company until there's money in that company to pay them a salary. That's perfectly rational. And so, if you've identified those people, it's good to know kind of who they are that'll be joining upon funding. This is all, again, just to make sure everyone, this is clear. This is pre-investment. This is before really any money goes into the company. This is how you set it up from day one. And then finally, so the third bucket here is the 20% option pool. That's probably a standard size option pool. You don't really want to forget to have an option pool. This is what you're going to use to incentivize new hires with awards day one, and then maybe re-up them annually or whenever you take an additional investment and they're diluted. You're gonna typically refresh this option pool every financing round. And it's usually targeted anywhere from, this says 15 to 25%. I've seen 10%, I've seen 30%, but typically you want to make sure you're thinking about an option pool to grant employees. And we'll talk more about options and what are the various ways one can set up your option pool. But I think the other point to make here is it usually doesn't make sense to just split it up equally. Let's say there are 4 academic scientific founders. It's typically not the right way to do it. Just say, okay, well, let's everyone just get an equal amount. It's often not the case, one, that everyone's contributed equally in the past. And even if they have, it's almost always not the case that everyone's going to contribute equally going forward. And if you remember what I said, equity is not just for past performance, it's also for future performance. So you really want to keep that in mind. And once you set this up and legally go through the process of making the company and granting the initial share ownership in the company, it's very hard to undo that and fix it. Oftentimes, the easiest way is to dissolve the company and start over, which presents its own host of challenges, especially if you have an option or a license to technology. So I would say that you have to be really careful and thoughtful before you make decisions around who's going to get what. And it's almost never the right answer that everyone should just get the same amount. All right, so this sort of sets the table. I'm going to turn it over to Nabil. He did a lot of the work around collecting data and refreshing the analysis of this presentation, which we gave probably 6-7 years ago, the last time we did it. So Nabil, why don't you take us through some initial terms just to kind of set the stage and then through some of the data.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so to kick things off, we're going to start with a few of the basic terms and definitions, and these are basically meant to help you navigate conversations with both your co-founders as well as other VCs as you think about fundraising if you're a startup. When building a company and raising venture dollars, you're going to get something called a term sheet from an investor that wants to give you money in exchange for a percentage of your company. The items you see on this slide can help you identify and understand a little bit about what you might see in that term sheet. So as venture investors, when we provide you with that term sheet, there's something called a pre-money valuation. This is what we think your company is worth today before you accept any outside capital. This is us assigning a value to everything you've built, all the hard work, the research, and the team building that you've done. So let's say, for example, your company has a pre-money valuation of $10 million. This is just one piece of the equation that will help determine how much of your company the investor is actually buying. And the post-money valuation is usually equal to the pre-money valuation plus the capital that we give you. So in our example, if you were worth $10 million beforehand and I give you $5 million, your post-money valuation is $15 million. To put more simply, these terms set the percentage of your company that we're going to buy. So in this example, we are offering you $5 million for approximately 33% of your company. And sometimes the post money is not always equal to this because of the impact of creating options pools. So that's just something to be aware of, and we're going to address that a little bit later on as well. So when you hear or read things like fully diluted shares or fully diluted ownership, that's basically the total outstanding shares that exist. Where generally, as a venture investor, we will buy something called preferred shares or preferred stock. And preferred shares are exactly that. They are preferred, they are better and more valuable because of some of the terms around them, which we'll go into in more detail later in the presentation when we talk about exit scenarios. And then common shares, on the other hand, are usually held by founders or anyone else on the early cap tables or people that have exercised options. This is in contrast to public companies where everything is common. Whether you've bought, $10 million of Apple stock, or, if you're a meme trader and you bought $1,000 of GameStop stock, those are all common shares. But in a private startup, these are classes of shares that can have a variety of terms associated with them. And not even preferred shares have to have the same terms. So I think it's important to touch more on dilution. When it comes to fundraising, it's all about how much money to actually raise. You could raise $1 million every couple months, or you could raise $10 million to last you 18 months or 2 years, or even $100 million that will last you 5 years. But what you should really be thinking about is this simple equation, which is your dilution. If you haven't raised any capital and you and your colleagues own 100% of the company, then when you take on venture capital, we're buying a portion of your company. And that amount that I'm buying is the dilution you will face. So in our previous example, that is the 33% that we discussed. It's the reduced ownership that you'll face after we own a portion of the company. And it's expressed as the amount of money you're raising divided by the post-money valuation of the round. And when you think about the capital you need to raise, it's a function of what you need to buy, how much you need to pay your employees, and some kind of non-functional measure of time, and also adjusted for an assumed level of risk. All those things go into you deciding how much to raise to create the most value inflection, because when we give you $5 million, we don't want it to turn into $5 million. We want it to turn into $20 million. And the valuation that you can create at your next round is some function of the revenue that you've produced, the attractiveness and excitement around your product or pipeline, the experience of your team, and the market opportunity that you're going after. And so some of these are very qualitative, sometimes non-financial judgments, but that valuation you generate governs your dilution. So for example, as I mentioned, you could raise $1 million and then you could raise $1 million again a few months later, but fundraising can be pretty exhausting. And then you could raise $100 million and be set for 5 years. But what's important is that the valuation you would get today is not what you might get in 18 months because you would have made progress in that time. So what you really want to do is optimize for the basic understanding of enough money to show demonstrable progress and create value inflection so that the next time you raise money, it's less dilutive. And generally in venture capital, every 18 months is a good cadence to go back to the street to raise more dollars. So we thought it would be good to actually visualize how dilution happens. And we touched on this in the previous slide when we discussed how valuation is a function of the round that you're raising and the valuation of the round. Oh, valuation of the company, sorry. For this, we looked at, for this slide, we looked at some average successful university startups. And I should mention this slide is probably dated 5 to 6 years now. So the raise size and the exit size might be a bit different today. But at the time, the average university startup was raising about $41 million across 4 rounds, and they would exit for around $240 million. And so the way you build your company is by raising just enough capital so that you don't have to hit the street too quickly. You want to raise around 18 months of capital and have that capital create some asymmetric gain on the valuation of the company. So in this example, founders and co-founders of the company own around 60% of the company, and they raise $1 million at a $4 million pre-money valuation. And so the goal of raising that $1 million is to turn it into $5 or $20 or $15 million of value. And in this example, they turn it into $6 million of value, which is really great too. And then the next round, the Series A shown here, is a $5 million raise on a $10 million pre-money valuation for the Series A. So that's 33% dilution that's happened. And so the math there is pretty simple. You take what you own and multiply it by 1 minus 33%. And so the initial 30% ownership for the lead founder or CEO and the co-founders and employees, it turns into 20%. And so this goes on round by round until the end, when you sum up the founders and co-founders, and they own around 24% of the company. And so really the point of showing this here is that by the end of a successful company, investors will actually own most of the company. And that's okay. It's the way you need to build your company so that you can have a valuable exit. So this next slide really just speaks to the breadth and depth of the enhanced data set behind this analysis. There is no one-size-fits-all to companies, and we've invested in over 100 university spinouts and decided to look at all the cap tables of these companies at their founding to understand the variety of ways the pie can be sliced. So this isn't necessarily what every company should do. You could say it's more of an example of what might make a good structure for a university spinout that we consider to be investable. So now, with about 4 times more data behind the story, we wanted to find out what is the right balance. And on this slide, we try to give you all an example of equity percentages that each of the roles was receiving when the company was founded. And it's a bit difficult to do this because, as you might know, the founder count can vary so greatly from company to company, and you can't split the pie the same way for all of them. But we were able to extract some general guidelines from this, which we're going to discuss in an upcoming slide as well, in much more detail. But the point to make here is that there's a decent amount of data and behind this, and we think that it can be representative of a quality cap table. And the other message is that every situation is different. So as I'd mentioned on the previous slide, we updated this analysis recently because it was so well received. And we get a lot of questions, but it's spurred a conversation and it has people thinking about it. And so that being said, we identified some interesting new tidbits in the data that we've laid out on this slide. And so the first one is founders, whether they are professors or grad students that are thinking about joining full-time, taking off from academia, or grad students. For grad students, it would be their next job. They're given asymmetric ownership over researchers and advisors and professors who may not have the ability or interest to join the company full-time. Oftentimes, there are a number of part-time faculty founders who join startups as founders and may be able to give 5, 10, 20% effort, but they can't do the 200% type effort. It's just not possible given they're also balancing their jobs in academia, which Matt had mentioned earlier. And so that's something you should expect to see, that in some ways, the incentivization of future performance is more heavily weighted than past contributions. And it's important to remember that when it comes down to it, investors are investing in the future and they respect the past. But something we look to make sure is that the people who are going to be driving the company forward are properly incentivized to do so. The other thing we noticed was that 10 out of the 63 founding CEOs we assessed were previously professors or grad students. And I think that really goes to show that some of the companies we invest in, not all of them, have found a way to bring in non-academic leaders. And that's something that we do find relevant to the quality of a company. We also found that most often when the founding inventor was a CEO, it was a tech company. Life science is sort of a different beast, which Matt can help answer questions on. But most companies in life science end up being formed by venture funds, and they might be surrounded by high quality entrepreneurship just right out of the gate. There's also a variety of equity distributions within the sectors, and the universities often have a stake in these companies, and we found that in our data, sometimes life science companies actually award the university more equity than tech companies. That's not always the case, but that's the general trend that we saw in our data. And another thing we often get asked is, and because we expressly say incentivize future performance, is that why shouldn't a faculty who has spent their life's work in this space, if they're, they might be preeminent in their field, they'll bring candidates and recruiting to the company and industry relationships, why shouldn't they be rewarded more? And the answer is that oftentimes they are. If they truly are of that caliber, there are many individuals in the founding teams who may or may not be full-time, but they still receive an asymmetric founder stake. We don't know for sure how much time these individuals spent at the company, but they still do get significant ownership. And that's what we're discussing right here in this last box. So without further ado, I'll get to the slide that everybody's probably been waiting for. And so referring back to the box and whisker chart we showed previously, this table takes a more quantifiable approach to what equity by role might actually look like before any options dilution comes into play. And again, these are not meant to be the rule. These are simply guidelines that you can use when you're thinking about equity. The roles on the top half of the table are some of the early line items we would see on the cap table of a university spinout. We think the founding CEO, which isn't always a non-academic, it could be a professor or a grad student, should own around 30% of the company. And when you have a few different founding inventors that are all very involved, those are in the 10 to 40% range, all depending on the number of founders involved. And I'll just mention again, you should also think about your options pool, that if there's a, let's say, for example, there was a 20% options pool here, then there would be dilution involved in these numbers, and you should mentally discount some of these figures by that dilution. One of the big takeaways here is that part-time faculty founders who aren't going to be working full-time at the company, who are maybe just spending a couple hours a week, should not expect to have an equal portion on the cap table. And we usually see this number float around 5% across many of the companies we invested in. And sometimes they do get more, as we discussed previously. But if we come across a cap table and we see someone with a large ownership and they're not really contributing to the company, we try to get to the bottom of it and understand what they're contributing. It's important to note that you can't really change equity after the fact, especially if you've already raised your first venture round. So make sure you're having clear conversations at formation about what you and your co-founders' contributions will be like. No startup is one size fits all, and the initial equity split should reflect that. And then we have the universities, who we found in our data set get between 3 to 12%. And this really takes shape due to either early seed dollars into faculty research programs or risk capital that they put out well before any other investors did. A lot of these institutions build up these really large venture centers, and it's helping the companies before they even realize they're asking for help. And on top of that, there's also regulations around IP that you all generate. We've seen all sorts of ranges, even up to 50% in some rare cases, where there's a huge effort by the university to help develop a certain technology, all the way down to just a couple percent. But generally, the bounds for most of the companies in our data set were between 3 and 12%. And so the last section of the table below is really meant to show you what the cap table might look like after a few fundraises and options pool refreshes. This can give you a more realistic idea of what the impact of dilution over rounds can do to ownership. But theoretically, your company theoretically your company should have a much higher valuation at this point in conjunction with that dilution. So just going back to Matt's comment about having a small slice of a big pie versus a big slice of a small pie. And a lot of times, university spinouts don't start out with a professional CEO, and it's totally fine if one of the faculty founders steps up. But we found that a professional CEO comes in later at some point with 5 to 10%, and 5 to 10% at this stage shown here is pretty similar to 30% pre-financing. And it's usually worth it to have that professional CEO.
So just to make a couple additional comments. One is something Nabil said, I think it's really important to reiterate, which is it's so important to have these explicit conversations before forming the company. These can actually be very hard conversations sometimes. You may be a grad student or postdoc and feel like it's a challenging discussion to have with your boss, essentially, on around who should own what. But I think these are really important conversations to have up front. And again, just settling for let's all just get equal is almost never the right answer. And these things can have real impact when you go out and look for investor dollars. Nabil said, we look at this very carefully. And if we don't think the folks involved have enough incentive or enough ownership to drive the company forward, we may choose not to invest because we just don't feel comfortable with that fact. So it can have real downstream implications on your ability to raise money. And I would say, to add, one of the things that can really help is get a good attorney. I mean, having a good attorney and a good law firm, whether that's external or folks internal to your institution, help you draft and set up the company the right way, help build the cap table the right way, have discussions with them about ownership and trends they've seen or transactions they've worked on with regards to company formation can be really valuable. So definitely make sure you're thinking really carefully and have the difficult conversations up front, because they're way, way harder to have later on. And if there are any questions as we're going through, happy to take them midway. We don't have to save them all for the end. So put them in the chat box. We can try and answer them as we go. But go ahead, Nabil.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So many of you in the audience might be tech transfer professionals, or you may be faculty founders as well, and you might have heard, or you may have said at some point that you deserve more equity in the company because you're continuing to provide resources to the company, and you should be rewarded for it. And the reality is that founders should be, and it just depends how much. And there's also key differences to address across tech and life science when it comes to this. In tech, some professors leave the university 1 to 2 years for 1 to 2 years and really become true employees of the company. And we've seen those faculty members gain a lot of experience in non-technical skill sets that are important to operating a startup. However, once they return to the university, or if they did both part-time, it's hard for them to stay up to date with the startup, and it can be even more difficult to contribute at the full intensity that's needed at the startup. And in life science, it seems to be more common that the professors will stay at the university, but will often participate on or chair the scientific advisory board of the startup. But regardless of tech or life science, scientific founders' value add to startups should be continuous through thought leadership to the science. Every startup needs to have a strong R&D pipeline, especially for university spinouts. They need to create that leading state-of-the-art cutting-edge technology, and we often see universities work with their professors to set up engagements with their startups to help continue to feed that funnel of technology, either through continual licensing or talent. And talent is actually one of the most important aspects of spinning out a company from a professor's lab. It creates a great new home for the next generation of entrepreneurial talent at startups because there's no one who knows the technology better than the grad students and postdocs that came from the professor's lab. And so we do see in the portfolio companies that we work with an above normal percentage of new hires come from the faculty members labs that were involved in starting the company. And the other part of it is that startups can be decent at marketing, but universities are usually much better at it, given their resources. And this actually gives the professors a different podium that they can use to raise the profile of the company. So through the university, entrepreneurship centers, and tech transfer offices, we've seen a lot of our faculty members leverage their relationship with the institution to put the startup on a highlight or engage with potential corporate customers as well from it. So the topic of equity allocation, which we touched on earlier, is very important. Going back to Matt's point about having a great lawyer, you can't change equity easily. And if you've taken any venture or angel dollars in, if you haven't taken any venture or angel dollars in, it's somewhat doable, but it can be an extremely painful process. And we always suggest to founders that they go work with a great lawyer and make sure you have the right structure on your founder's equity shares. And again, as Matt mentioned, no one should be given fully vested upfront founder shares. They should be vested in a schedule, and lawyers are really the right people to help you structure that. When you do think about the structure we presented earlier of rewarding past successes and incentivizing future performance, it's important to recognize that it will lead to unequal equity distributions. We do think that companies with three or four or more founders shouldn't split their equity equally. Everyone has a different role. Some will be part-time, but even if they are full-time, some may have different commitments in their life that will obviously lead to lower contributions in the long run. And so we really do think that equity allocation needs to be done well upfront, because if it's not, it's hard to take back, and it can lead to a lack of equity for other employees that you may be bringing in. Now, for example, if you have a grad student who decides they want to go into industry after a year or two, and he's sitting on your cap table with a huge chunk of equity, you're going to run into an issue when you go to hire a replacement, and it's going to have to come out of your option pool, which is going to dilute all existing shareholders. And so these are some of the key things that we think about. And when you do have a poor equity allocation, really the only solution is to recapitalize the company, which is what Matt had mentioned earlier when he said, dissolving the entire company and starting fresh. You can't remove a shareholder very easily, and it's something investors don't like to do. So it's important to note that if we do see a messy cap table when evaluating a startup, it creates just another difficult hurdle to get over to consider investing in the company. So it's definitely something to think about early. And we at OUP, we love it when founders or tech transfer offices reach out to us for feedback on a initial cap table when they're just getting started, and we're happy to be a resource for things like that. And so those same consequences we discussed apply to investors as well. Equity allocations for founders can happen. The same sort of bad equity allocations for founders can also happen when you take on investors. Especially in the early days when you might be surrounded by lots of different angel groups or angel investors or pre-seed investors who may have a different idea of what a time horizon looks like than your average institutional investor in university startups. So think of it the same way. You want to make sure you're working with people you know and you understand. Make sure you do diligence on your investors and make sure they're aware of what they're getting into. Just because oftentimes the terms that they can put in their term sheet for a round will stick around for a very long time. So you should operate with the assumption that anything you accept today will likely be desired by future investors. Series A investors won't let an angel investor have better terms than they did. They're going to want the same terms.
And I would add to that, one of the points there is obstructive behavior. We have seen certain investors who feel, if they get a certain ownership threshold, for example, that they may have some control. And so, they may block a financing, that you receive because maybe it's not at a valuation they like. So again, giving equity to investors who you're not aligned with, who may not, have the company's best interest in mind can be detrimental downstream. And we've seen those kind of things pop up.
Thanks, Matt. So this slide is just a reminder that your options pool goes down over time. And as we had mentioned, oftentimes it can be around 15 to 25%. It could be a little less, it could be a little more, but you create it at the start of the company. And then when you're hiring employees, you give a couple percent out to your best employees, and by the time you get to your next round, your option pool might be depleted down to 1 or 2%. And so you'll need to top that pool back up again at your next round, which will dilute your ownership. And every time you raise, you're likely increasing your option pool. And sometimes when employees leave the company, some of them might be vested and sitting on your cap table, and you may need to incentivize a new hire with a similar set of options as well. And so that takes us to the next slide, which really drives the point home that you shouldn't be afraid to use your options, because without your team, you'll end up with nothing. The path to success for startups is often consistent with a growing team. And so although you will be diluted, you should continue to utilize your options pool properly to not only hire new talent, but also incentivizing existing talent. And so this next slide shows you an example of that, of how you can utilize your option grants at various levels, from hiring to promotions to performance bonuses, as well as retention. And it continues to play back to the theme of how you reward for past successes, but you want to continue to incentivize future performance. And here are just some examples of ways that companies may issue option grants to employees at different levels. So there isn't a ton to talk about here, but these are the different types of options that you can give. Generally, for employees, you're working with RSUs, or restricted stock units, or ISOs, incentive stock options. ISOs are the most common, and RSUs are really something you use at the founding of the company, but not really afterwards.
And again, it says at the bottom very, very clearly, always build investing into your equity plans, even for founder shares. Again, once you give equity, it's very, very hard to take back. So you want a mechanism by which, for example, you gave somebody founder shares and they didn't stick around, they left for something else, or there was personality conflicts or some issues where somebody decided to leave. You know, it doesn't make sense for them to have all that ownership going forward. It's just, you'll be unable to incentivize somebody new to join. You won't have the equity available for it. So, you know, you want to build vesting into that, and folks should earn their equity ownership over time, even for those founding shares.
So just bringing everything full circle here. This picture of a pie is something of a historical lesson that we've always included in these talks, and it's impactful mostly for faculty to hear. And it's this: you can either have a big piece of a small pie or a small piece of a big pie. Ultimately, what you want is a small piece of a big pie. And the only way to build that big pie is to hire a team and raise capital to bring on new money to grow your team and build your business. And it's also important to remember, in taking capital from venture investors, you are giving away control, and that's just part of what the startup world is about. So in this last section, we're going to be talking through an example exit scenario that might be interesting if you haven't been exposed to cap table math. It's similar to the bar chart you saw before, except here we're going to have a simulated set of fundraising inputs for a startup. And in this case, we wanted to go through a few rounds and then 2 exit scenarios so that you can start to understand how venture ownership affects final payouts. But before we get into the example, there are a few more terms that would be helpful to see and understand that we're going to reference in those scenarios. So when VCs offer terms, it revolves around what we call the liquidation preference. If it wasn't for liquidation preferences, the terms in a term sheet would be much more straightforward and easy to understand. Preferred shares have a different value than common shares because this liquidation preference exists. For example, we could put any one of these 3 categories in a term sheet for our preferred shares. And the first thing to understand about investors who are buying preferred shares is the concept of first capital in, first capital out. So if I'm giving you $5 million and your company gets acquired tomorrow, I would get my $5 million back. And depending on which of these terms we agree on, whatever is remaining may go to founders, common shareholders, or get distributed to us, or we could choose to convert to a common share basis. We can choose many different options that benefit us when we're underwriting an investment and giving the final term sheet. And it's important to note, though, that when finalizing the investment, only one of these can really apply. So the participating preferred is when I take my investment out first, and I also get to participate in the upside. So I get to participate in the front end pullout and participate in whatever is left. This is actually the most favorable venture term you can get. And this is a key thing, favorable for the investor. This is a key thing to consider when bringing in venture capital. It's that investors will get their money back first, and it only really becomes an issue when you get acquired for something on the order of what you've raised, which is one of the examples we'll get into actually. So just for simplicity, if you raise $5 million and get acquired for $7 million, the investors get their first $5 million back. And so whatever happens with the remaining $2 million depends on some of these terms. So it's very important. Capped it basically just caps how much we can get back. And then the 1x non-participating preferred is actually the standard terminology that investors offer most often today. It's basically this scenario where, as an investor, I choose to get my $5 million back, or I can convert to common on a fully diluted basis, so that my return is governed by the same equation as yours, which is how much of the company do I own times the exit value. All right. So in this scenario, on the left bar, we have a company that's going to be acquired for $250 million, and their founding structure here is represented by 40, 20, 40% for the lead founder or CEO, 40% for the co-founders and employees, and then 20% option pool. And so here they're raising a $5 million seed round on a $10 million pre-money valuation. And so there is a 33% dilution involved in this right here. And so the next Series A round, they raise $15 million on a $45 million pre-money valuation, and they're diluted. So they've only raised $20 million by the time they're acquired for $250 million. And everyone is happy in this scenario. The company has been acquired for well above what they've raised from a venture capital perspective. The payouts are typically based on just the percent ownership of the company. There's a slight tweak in the math here that the Series A had a participating preferred, which is why the math isn't perfectly matched to the numbers. As we had discussed, the participating preferred is a favorable term to an investor, and it's basically a way for them to get a little bit more juice from the squeeze. And so this is an up case. This is where everyone's happy. This is what you want. But then there's also down cases, and this is when the acquisition is not very good. So it's a $25 million acquisition after raising a total of 20 million of venture capital. In this scenario, it seems like there's still enough for everyone to make some money, but in reality, since the company raised 20 million and there was a participating preferred, the investors get their first 20 million or so off the top of that 25. In fact, here it's 21.7 million, and that's because the Series A investors had a participating preferred. So really, all that's left is around $3.2 million for the co-founders to share. So just getting to the key takeaways, the main point here is that dilution is necessary in order to get to the large exit. Dilution is not the bad guy. And there are exceptions. There are a few companies that are able to organically grow and bootstrap themselves to be worth several hundreds of millions of dollars. It absolutely happens, but it's not common. And most often, the types of companies that we invest in and the types of companies our universities are part of spinning out, they're capital intensive companies, whether they're developing drugs and they need to pay for clinical trials, or they're developing chips or quantum computers, or building a software company with a huge sales team. And it can be difficult. It can be difficult for faculty to realize they're going to have to give up the majority of their company, despite the fact that they made an incredible innovation that started the company. But as we had mentioned, the dilution is necessary to help you get to that large exit. And the ultimate prize is affected by the round by round dilution the most. There's also the liquidation preferences and the nuances around, participating and non-participating preferred. But the key things that drive how much money you'll have in your pocket and the success of the company is the round by round dilution. So really focus on minimizing dilution. And that doesn't always mean maximizing valuation, because you can always take a lower valuation, work with some great investors, and increase your value in the next round more than you would if you simply just worked with the venture investor who offered the highest valuation in the previous round. So these are the types of things that we think about. It's not always about taking the largest amount you can raise either. Sometimes instead of taking $100 million, it's better to take $20 million and grow it to 80. And then in the next round, raise 80, and you can turn it into much more. And so there's a compounding effect there that faculty founders and universities should really work through the math on to understand the impact of dilution at various stages. Another key thing, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Nabil, I was just going to jump in and add a couple comments, and kind of goes back to that down scenario. That's the scenario that nobody wants to talk about, but you need to think about and plan for. And if you raise in his scenario, 20 million, and you get acquired for 25 million, ultimately, and as it shows here, there's not that much for the founder, CEO, the employees here on the back end. But what if this was even worse? What if it was only 15 million acquisition after you raise 20? In essence, all of the money would go to the investors. There would be nothing left for anyone else. And so that, in that case, the team, you'd say, would get zero. It doesn't always work like that exactly in the real world. There are some real world implications of that. If you want your CEO to go forward and complete the transaction and continue to work for the company, you can't tell them they're going to get nothing following completion of the transaction. They're not incentivized. Again, it's all about incentives. They're not incentivized to go forward and actually do the deal. So oftentimes you'll have some sort of carve out, across your your $15 million acquisition. And you'll say you're going to give some to the CEO or whatever the management team is required to actually complete the transaction. Often that means maybe the lower level employees who don't need to be around for the transaction may get nothing. The university may get nothing. The academic founders, if they are not really involved in the company or important for completing the transaction, may get nothing. So there are several scenarios where even though the company's acquired for a decent amount of money, it may end up, there may be nothing for certain, parts of people. And a lot of it has to do with, preferred shares, just getting their money out first. And that's there's no real way to work around that. Venture investors don't invest in and buy common. That's just not how it works. So it's definitely something to think about. That's really in that negative sort of down outcome. And this really math sort of exemplifies, why that happens, why, the company got 15 million in an acquisition, but why certain groups didn't get anything.
We actually have a question in the chat, which since we're running short on time, I thought it would be good for you all to address.
So the question is from Michael Atkin. Thanks for the question. So have you run across professors on their first spin out who end up turning down investment as they're not willing to surrender control? In your experience, what's the % of academic founders who waste everyone's time as they insist on keeping all of the tiny pie? It's a good question. So I want to separate two things. One is control and the other is, I'll call greed, for lack of a better word. I think they're slightly different. So I think they're, when it comes to control, there are definitely folks who feel like by taking on investment dollars, they're giving up control of their company. I would make the comment, and Nabil, you feel free to jump in, that investors, venture capital investors, do not want to control your company. We do not want to run your company. We really have no interest in doing that. In fact, we're too busy and we're working on too many things, and we have too many other companies that we're thinking about to want to run or control any one of them. So what the control provisions in a venture investor investment really mean is that if things started to go really poorly for the company, and we needed to step in and make a change, we have the ability or control to do that. But it's not what we want to do. We don't want to change, especially if things are going well. And quite honestly, if things are going really poorly, as the founder, you should want things to change, because if things are going poorly, the company's going to fail and it's not going to be worth anything to you anyway. So so that's the first point. Investors really don't want control. We want to back great people and let them run the company. And it's only in the case where things are going really poorly where control might come in. The other point you made, though, was sort of I'd say the greed aspect of this, not wanting to take dilution, not wanting to own less of the company. And quite honestly, there's in a lot of ways, we've seen a very small percentage of startups, I don't know if we can quantify it, Nabil, where faculty feel that way and they persist and they take grants, and it takes time. Usually takes way longer than it would have if they had taken investment, but ultimately it is successful, and they own a lot of the company and they make a lot of money. In fact, as an example, I read an article about this the other day. The recent Biogen Alzheimer's antibody, the one they had partnered with, I'm forgetting the other company they had partnered with on, but this was actually, I think, not the approved antibody, but the one they just had data on that looks really good. That I think was IP from Sweden, and the founders had not really taken much investment on this before it eventually ended up in the hands of big pharma, and they owned a lot of it, like 80+% of it. And so but I think it's been like 25 years in the making. So, great, it's great for them. It did get to a really great place, and they're probably going to make a lot of money, and they owned a lot of the company, and, it just took a really long time to get there and have an impact. But I'd say the vast majority of these cases, to sort of the point Michael was making, was sort of waste everyone's time. The vast majority, of when that happens, it's a waste of time, and ultimately it's going to fail. It's not going to succeed, because these companies, I invest in biotech companies. They require a tremendous amount of capital, way more than you think, to ever achieve an exit or get someone to buy you. The vast majority of the time. So, if you're trying to develop a drug and you're not willing to raise money or take dilution, it's 99.9% chance it's just not going to get there. So I think owning a lot of a very small pie, can work in what we might call lifestyle businesses, companies that generate a small amount of revenue, you get a little bit of profit, it's great. That's not the kind of company investors want to invest in anyways, and that's fine. I think that doesn't make it a bad business. But if it's the kind of company or business where you need to take on a lot of capital to be successful, and you're not willing to do that, it's likely not going to have an impact on whatever group it is you're looking to have an impact on. Turn to Nabil, do you add to that, or Lori?
No, thank you for that was a very comprehensive answer and a good question. In the interest of time, I thought we should kind of come to the conclusion. So I don't know if you all have parting thoughts. I just wanted to say thank you and encourage anyone, if they're thinking of doing or any kind of startup, please consider PCI your first stop and a resource. We work closely with Osage. Thank you for sharing your contact info. I know you all are always very generous with your time and willing to talk to anyone. So thank you in advance. And I'll let you all have the closing word.
Sure. Nabil, go ahead if you have anything.
Yeah, thank you. I guess the last thing I would say is, you know, it's very important for, you know, both the university tech transfer offices and founders alike to really, you know, work through the math on eventual exits the same way that investors do. You know, those exit scenarios we showed you, we're doing that for companies that we evaluate before we invest in. And at every round, we're always looking at what the expected final outcome can look like. And so just the valuation of a single round is not enough information. And so just make sure you're educating yourself as much as possible, going all the way to the finish line rather than, you know, just where you're presently standing.
And my parting thoughts are, one, echoing Laurie's comment, please go to her and the team there and utilize their resources, talk to them. There's a wealth of knowledge and information and experience there. So, you know, and we really appreciate having them as partners. And then finally, you know, this is what we do. We invest in companies. If you have good ideas or things you're thinking about, you know, feel free to reach out. We'll get you to the right person internally if it's not one of us. And thanks for taking the time to listen. And we have other talks on other topics, like how do you value companies or how do you come up with valuations? And, you know, we'll hopefully give talks on other topics in the future. So thanks for joining.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.